$3 million. That's how much my son got, and in less than a day, he looked at me like I was nothing. Imagine raising a child, feeding them, sacrificing for them, building their entire life from scratch, and then, the moment fortune comes their way, they toss you out like last week's trash. That's what happened to me. The sting wasn't just in the act of being thrown out of my own home, it was in the coldness of his eyes when he did it. He had always been my boy, the one I thought would carry my legacy. But money has a way of twisting people, doesn't it? It can blind them, make them forget who stood beside them when they had nothing. I'll never forget that night. His voice was sharp, unrecognizable, not the same tone he once used when he called me Dad with respect. He said, "You don't belong here anymore. I can take care of myself now." I didn't even argue, because sometimes silence is the only shield you have against heartbreak. I stepped outside with nothing but the clothes on my back and the bitter wind pressing against my face. Do you know what it feels like to stand outside your own house and realize you're a stranger there? It's like the ground beneath your feet doesn't recognize you anymore. And while he sat inside, counting his millions, I was left wondering how the son I raised could erase me so easily. But here's the thing, life doesn't let arrogance sit comfortably for long. When you think you're untouchable, life has a way of reminding you that you're not. 3 days, that's all it took. Just 3 days before he came crawling back, knocking at my door, begging for my help. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why he came back, you need to see the full picture of what happened in those 3 days, and how quickly a fortune can turn into a curse. The money had come suddenly. He wasn't a businessman, he wasn't some genius investor. It was pure luck, a deal that landed in his lap, an inheritance that fell from the sky. Call it whatever you want, it wasn't earned through sweat and calloused hands. Easy come, easy go. I had warned him all his life that shortcuts breed weakness, but he never listened. The moment that $3 million hit his account, he thought he was a king. He bought new suits, flashy jewelry, cars he didn't even know how to drive. He strutted around like the whole world owed him something. People who had ignored him for years suddenly became his best friends. They circled him like vultures around a carcass, flattering him, laughing at his jokes that weren't funny, praising him as if he was royalty. And he believed them. He actually believed them. I knew the difference. I could see through those smiles, those false handshakes, those eyes that lingered not on him, but on his wallet. He thought they respected him, but all they respected was the money in his pocket. Respect that is bought is not respect. It's a loan, and it comes with interest. I wanted to tell him that, but he had already closed his ears to me. He thought I was jealous, or bitter, or maybe even old-fashioned. He didn't realize that the only person in his life who would ever tell him the truth was the same one he had just thrown out. Those first 2 nights, I slept in a friend's basement. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. Pride is a heavy thing to swallow, but colder is the floor when you have nowhere else to go. I sat awake most of the night, thinking about how quickly everything had changed, and a part of me wondered if maybe this was my fault. Did I raise him wrong? Did I shelter him too much? Did I not teach him enough about loyalty and gratitude? But then I remembered all the lessons I gave, all the sacrifices I made, all the nights I worked late so he could go to school, so he could eat, so he could live without worry. No, I had done my part. What he did was his choice, and now he had to live with it. By the 3rd day, I heard whispers. His new friends had already started circling tighter. Money attracts not just leeches, but sharks. They smell blood in the water, and when they do, they don't just want to sip, they want to tear you apart piece by piece. He started receiving calls, threats even, people demanding favors, loans, opportunities. They promised him quick profits if he just handed over a slice of his fortune. And of course, my son, in his arrogance, thought he could play their game. He gave too much too fast, trusted too many too easily, and in just 3 days the cracks in his empire had already begun to show. I didn't know all of this at the time, I only pieced it together later. But what I did know was this. On the third evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned sharp, I heard a knock at the door of the basement where I was staying. When I opened it, I saw him, my son, the same one who had thrown me out like garbage. But his eyes were different now. They weren't filled with arrogance or pride. They were filled with fear, real, bone-deep fear. And when he spoke, his voice trembled, desperate. "Dad," he said, "I need your help." You know that moment when the world suddenly flips? When the one who thought he didn't need you, who thought he was bigger than you, suddenly realizes you were the only thing keeping him afloat? That was the moment standing in front of me. My son, the millionaire, begging the man he had abandoned only days before. And I stood there, looking at him, torn between the father in me who wanted to protect him and the man in me who wanted to let him taste the consequences of his betrayal. Because sometimes the only way someone truly learns is when they're forced to suffer the weight of their own choices. And yet I couldn't walk away, because no matter how much he hurt me, no matter how deeply he betrayed me, he was still my son. But I wasn't going to make it easy for him. If he wanted my help, he was going to have to face the truth. And that truth was this: money doesn't save you, it exposes you. It shows the world who you really are, and if you're not ready for that, it will devour you whole. The question wasn't whether I would help him, but whether he was ready to hear what I had to say. Whether he was ready to let go of the arrogance and listen to the man he had dismissed. And as I looked into his trembling eyes, I realized something important. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival, and it was about whether my son was strong enough to climb out of the pit he had dug for himself before it swallowed him alive. That was the night everything shifted. The night he went from conqueror to beggar in less than 72 hours. And as he stood there, waiting for my answer, I knew this was only the beginning of a story neither of us would ever forget. I didn't answer him right away. I let the silence stretch between us, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. He shuffled nervously on the doorstep, his expensive shoes scuffed from pacing, his tailored jacket wrinkled from stress. He didn't look like the rich young man who had pushed me aside just days ago. He looked like a boy again, small, frightened, and out of his depth. And for a moment, I remembered the nights he used to crawl into my room during thunderstorms, whispering, "Dad, I'm scared." The difference was, back then, I could shield him from the thunder. Now, the storm was of his own making. I finally stepped aside and let him in, but not without a warning in my eyes. He walked in, sat down heavily, and buried his face in his hands. His watch gleamed, his ring sparkled, but none of it could cover the exhaustion carved into his skin. When he finally spoke, his words spilled out like a broken dam. "They're after me, Dad. I don't know who to trust. I don't know what to do. I thought I could handle it, but I can't." I leaned back and listened, not interrupting. It's strange how desperation makes people honest. He confessed things I hadn't imagined. The money he thought was secure was already vanishing. He had invested blindly into schemes that promised double returns in a week. He had loaned out huge sums to people he barely knew, people who had promised loyalty in exchange for a taste of his wealth. And now those same people were circling, demanding more, threatening him when he refused. He had surrounded himself with predators and only realized too late that he was the prey. $3 million, I said quietly, and in 3 days you've managed to nearly lose it all. He winced like my words were a knife, but I wasn't trying to wound him, I was trying to wake him. Because what he needed wasn't pity, it was clarity. He kept talking, telling me how his so-called friends had been pressuring him, how strangers were suddenly showing up at his door, claiming to be distant relatives, how he couldn't sleep because his phone never stopped buzzing with requests. It was a nightmare dressed in luxury. He thought money would buy him peace, but it had only bought him chains. And now, the same son who had told me he didn't need me was begging me to tell him what to do. I could have said, "I told you so." I could have laughed bitterly at the irony. But what good would that have done? No, he didn't need reminders of his mistakes. He needed a plan. And plans require discipline, something he had never learned, because fortune had spared him the pain of earning things the hard way. So I asked him a question that cut straight through his panic. Do you want me to save you, or do you want me to teach you how to save yourself? He looked up at me with wide, tearful eyes, and for the first time in years, he was speechless. That was the first test, because until he could admit that he wasn't in control, there was no way forward. Finally, after a long pause, he whispered, "Teach me." And those words, more than his begging, more than his trembling voice, showed me that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to change. The next morning, I walked into his house for the first time since he had thrown me out. It felt strange stepping back in, like walking into a museum of bad decisions. Expensive furniture, overpriced art, electronics scattered everywhere, things bought not because he needed them, but because he wanted to show others that he could. The house was loud even in its silence, because everything inside screamed vanity. I didn't comment on it. Instead, I asked to see his accounts, his transactions, his records. At first, he resisted, old pride flickering up again, but the look I gave him reminded him of why he had come to me. He opened his laptop, and as I scrolled through the numbers, I felt a mix of anger and sorrow. Hundreds of thousands gone in investments that were nothing more than scams. Tens of thousands loaned to people who hadn't even given him receipts. Money poured into cars and watches that would lose value the moment he walked out the door with them. "You don't have a money problem," I told him. "You have a judgment problem, and judgment is the one thing money cannot buy." He stayed quiet, his hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. I could see the shame flooding through him. It wasn't the loss of the money that broke him. It was realizing how easily he had been fooled, how shallow the loyalty of his new friends really was. That night, his phone rang again and again. He ignored it, but I insisted he answer one call on speaker. A voice barked through the line, demanding repayment, threatening consequences. My son looked at me, terrified. I just listened calmly until the voice hung up. "This is what happens," I said, "when you build your kingdom on sand. It collapses at the first wave." He asked me what to do about the threats, the pressure, the debts he had piled up, and I told him something he wasn't ready to hear. You're going to lose more before you win. But losing will teach you what winning never could. The truth is, $3 million isn't freedom, it's a test. For some, it becomes a tool. For others, a weapon. For many, a coffin. My son had been digging his own, and now he had to stop. The following day, I made him sit down with a notebook and write out every single person he owed money to, every single promise he had made, every single lie he had told himself about wealth meant. He resisted at first, but I forced him to confront it. And as he wrote, the list grew longer and longer, until his hands shook and his eyes burned with tears. He finally saw the weight of the chains he had put on himself. When he finished, he looked up at me and asked, "Can I fix this?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth is, fixing it wasn't about recovering the money. It was about recovering himself. And that was going to take more than numbers on a screen. It was going to take something he hadn't given me in years: trust. That night was the first time in years my son and I sat together without the noise of arguments, pride, or money between us. The house was quiet, though his phone kept buzzing on the counter, lighting up with names he now realized weren't friends, but predators circling for their share. He didn't dare pick it up. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exhausted, waiting for me to tell him the answer. But answers don't come that easily, they're earned. I looked at him and said, "If you want to survive this, you need to understand something first. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. It revealed your greed. It revealed the lies of those around you. And now it's revealing the fact that you don't know how to stand alone." He flinched, but didn't argue. That was a good sign. The next morning, I made him wake up early. He had gotten used to staying up all night in parties, dinners, and fake social circles, sleeping until noon like a man without responsibility. That had to end. Discipline before decisions, I told him. If you can't control your mornings, you'll never control millions. He grumbled at first, but followed. We sat at the table, coffee in hand, as I explained the rules he would have to follow if he wanted my help. Rule 1, no more bleeding money into people you barely know. Rule 2, learn to say no, even if it makes you the villain. Rule 3, every cent must have a purpose, not just a price tag. He listened carefully, nodding, though I could see the weight of it sinking in. The truth is, stripping away bad habits hurts more than losing money. Because when you lose money, you can still blame others. But when you face your flaws, you can only blame yourself. By the second day of my staying with him, reality began to bite harder. 2 men showed up at the door. They weren't dressed like businessmen or polite lenders. No, they looked rough, eyes sharp, words sharper. They asked for him by name, demanding repayment for money he had loaned out. They claimed he owed them, that he had promised more than he could deliver. My son panicked, but I stepped forward, my voice calm, firm. I told them that any deals they had were over, and if they wanted to test it further, they'd have to go through me. They didn't like that. They muttered threats, spat on the ground, and left, but I could see in their eyes that this wasn't over. When the door closed, my son nearly collapsed. "Dad, what are we going to do? They'll come back." I looked at him, steady, and said, "They will. And that's exactly why you need to learn how to face them. You don't get stronger by hiding. You get stronger by standing." That night, I told him a story he had long forgotten. Years ago, when he was just a child, our family had been cheated out of a large sum of money by someone I trusted. We had nothing left, but I didn't cave. I worked harder. I rebuilt. I carried him on my back when I could barely carry myself. Strength, I told him, isn't about never being broken. It's about what you do after you've been broken. He stared at me in silence for a long time. I think that was the first moment he saw me not as just his father, but as a man who had fought battles he never even knew existed. The following morning, I made him call every single person he had loaned money to or promised investments to. His voice trembled on each call. Some laughed at him, others mocked him, and a few even threatened him again. But he endured it. I sat beside him, watching, making sure he didn't fold. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about building a backbone. By the end of the day, his face was pale, his hands shaking, but his eyes were different. They weren't filled with panic anymore. They were tired, yes, but beneath that tiredness was something new. Resolve. The kind that only comes after you've been humiliated and still stood up again. He asked me, "Do you think I can come back from this?" And I told him something he didn't expect. You might lose every dollar you have left, but if you gain wisdom, discipline, and strength, you'll be richer than any of those men chasing you. He sat there quietly, turning those words over, and for the first time in days, he didn't look afraid. He looked ready. He looked like my son again. But what neither of us realized then was that his problems were far from over. The real test wasn't the fake friends or the debts. It was the storm that was about to break over him, the one that would push him to his limits and force him to decide who he truly wanted to be. And when that storm came, not even 3 million. The storm arrived faster than either of us expected. It was the third morning since he had shown up at my door begging for help, and the air in the house was thick with tension. He hadn't slept well. The constant buzzing of his phone, the pounding in his head from stress, it was eating him alive. I told him to put the phone on silent, but he couldn't resist glancing at it every few minutes, as if ignoring the messages might make the problems disappear. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't let you look away. Then came the knock. Not polite, not casual. It was the kind of knock that makes the walls tremble, the kind that lets you know the person on the other side isn't here for tea. He froze, his face draining of color. I didn't move right away. Instead, I watched him, because this was his moment to choose. Would he hide, or would he finally stand? But when his eyes darted toward me, pleading silently, I knew he wasn't ready yet. So I stood up and opened the door. 3 men stood there. Not slick businessmen in suits, but heavy-set figures with eyes like stone. The kind of men who don't ask twice. One of them smiled, but it wasn't a smile you could trust. "We need to talk," he said. My son's breath hitched behind me. I didn't step aside. "Talk about what?" I asked calmly. He glanced past me into the house. "Your boy owes us. Promises were made, money was exchanged, and now we're running out of patience." I felt my son trembling behind me, but I didn't let it show. Fear is contagious. If I broke, he'd shatter. So I looked straight into the man's eyes and said, "If you have business, it will be settled. But threats don't scare me, and they won't solve anything for you either." There was a pause, a heavy silence. Then the man smirked. "You've got guts, old man. Let's see if your son has the same." Then they left, but not before making it clear they'd return soon, and next time it wouldn't just be words. When the door shut, my son collapsed into a chair, clutching his head. "Dad, I can't do this. I can't fight these people. They'll ruin me. They'll take everything." His voice cracked, and in that moment, I saw the truth. He wasn't just afraid of losing his money. He was afraid of losing himself. He had built his entire identity on being rich, on being admired, and now that was slipping away like sand through his fingers. I sat across from him and leaned in. "Listen to me carefully. They don't want you. They don't even care about you. All they see is the money. And here's the secret they don't want you to know. If you stop playing their game, if you take away the thing they're chasing, they lose their power. You've been feeding wolves, and the only way to stop being prey is to stop giving them meat." He stared at me, confused. "What are you saying? That I give up the money?" I nodded slowly. "Not all of it, but enough to cut ties, enough to show them that their hold on you is over. It will hurt. It will feel like you're losing everything, but you're not. You're buying back your freedom." He sat in silence, torn between his pride and his survival. The idea of letting go of even $1 pained him, but the fear of those men returning was stronger. Finally, he whispered, "Okay, tell me what to do." The next few hours were brutal. We went through his accounts line by line, identifying where he could pull money quickly, who he could pay off, who he had to cut off completely. It wasn't about saving face anymore, it was about survival. Every call he made was a wound. Some people cursed him, some laughed at him, some threatened him further. But with each call, each severed tie, I could see something shifting inside him. He was no longer the arrogant boy who thought money made him untouchable. He was becoming something else, humbled but sharper. By the end of the day, he had given up more than half of what was left. Painful, yes, but necessary. And when the dust settled, there were fewer voices screaming at him, fewer debts hanging over his head. He still wasn't safe, but he had taken the first real step toward stability. That night, as he sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, he finally said something I'd been waiting years to hear. "I thought money would make me powerful, but it made me weak. I thought it would make people love me, but it just made them love what I had." He turned to me, his voice breaking. "You were right all along, Dad. I should have listened." I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "It's not about listening to me. It's about listening to life. And life doesn't whisper, it shouts. You just ignored it until it had to scream." For the first time in a long time, he fell asleep without the music of parties or the buzz of fake friends. Just silence. Heavy, cleansing silence. But as much as he had started to learn, I knew the hardest lesson was still ahead. Because giving up money is one thing. Facing yourself, that's where the real battle begins. The hardest battles are never fought with fists or even with money. They're fought in silence, deep inside the mind, where no one else can see. And that's exactly where my son now found himself. The morning after he finally started cutting ties, I found him sitting at the dining table, his head buried in his arms. There were no calls buzzing his phone this time, no fake friends banging on the door asking for handouts. But the silence that filled the house was almost worse. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and muttered, "It's so quiet now. Where is everyone?" That single question cut deeper than any insult he'd thrown at me days before. Because I realized in that moment, he wasn't just mourning the money he'd lost. He was mourning the illusion. The people who used to crowd around him weren't friends. They were shadows attracted to his flame. And once that flame dimmed, they vanished. I sat down across from him and said, "Now you see it, don't you? The crowd wasn't yours. The laughter wasn't yours. The love wasn't yours. All of it belonged to the money. And now that it's gone, you're left with the only person you've been running from, yourself." He didn't reply. His jaw tightened, and I could see the weight of those words sinking in. Because deep down, he knew I was right. For the rest of that day, I gave him no distractions, no advice, no conversations, no comfort, just space. Because sometimes the only way someone grows is when they're forced to sit alone with their own reflection. And it wasn't easy for him. He paced the halls, he stared out the window, he cursed under his breath. At one point, he even snapped at me. "Why aren't you helping me? Why aren't you telling me what to do?" I looked at him calmly and said, "Because if I tell you everything, you'll only depend on me. But if you figure it out yourself, you'll never need me again." That silenced him. By evening, something shifted. He came to me, his face softer, almost childlike, and said, "Dad, I don't even know who I am without all of this. I don't know how to be strong without showing off. I don't know how to live without people around me. I feel empty." I nodded slowly. "Good," I told him. His eyes widened at my response, but I continued. "Emptiness is not a curse. It's a beginning. It means you finally cleared out all the noise. Now you have room to build something real. You don't realize it yet, but this is the first time you've actually had a chance to discover yourself." That night, instead of parties, he sat with me at the kitchen table, and we talked. Not about money, not about mistakes, but about life. I told him about the years he was too young to remember, how I struggled when his mother left us, how I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, how there were nights I went hungry so he wouldn't have to. He listened quietly, tears forming in his eyes, as if seeing me for the first time, not as some nagging father, but as a man who had survived storms of his own. For the first time, he asked me something no son ever asks easily. "Dad, how did you do it? How did you keep going when everything was against you?" I leaned back, looked him in the eye, and told him the truth. Because I never saw giving up as an option. Life doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't care if you're tired. It just keeps coming. And the only choice you really have is whether you're going to stand or whether you're going to let it bury you. Every day I chose to stand, even when it hurt, even when I thought I couldn't. And that's what made me strong. He nodded, silent but absorbing every word. The next morning, I made him start again from scratch. No more luxury tours, no more pointless purchases, no more handing out money. We sold off things he didn't need, returned what could be returned, cut every single expense that was bleeding him dry. He hated it at first, watching his kingdom shrink, but with each item that left, I saw a strange calm begin to settle in him, as if he was realizing that he wasn't losing himself with those things gone. If anything, he was gaining clarity. But life, as always, doesn't let lessons go untested. Later that week, one of his old so-called friends returned, smiling as though nothing had happened. He came with promises of a new deal, an opportunity to make it all back and more. My son's eyes flickered with temptation for a moment. I saw it, that old hunger. But then he looked at me, steadying himself, and shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "I'm done with shortcuts." The man's smile dropped instantly, and he walked away, muttering under his breath. My son shut the door and leaned against it, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like he had just fought a war. I smiled faintly. "That was the first real step," I said. He didn't reply, but I saw the pride in his eyes. Not the arrogant pride he once wore like a crown, but a quiet pride, the kind that comes from resisting weakness. Yet, even with this progress, I knew the story wasn't over. He had lost friends, money, and illusions. But there was one more thing he had to face before his transformation was complete. The very people who had threatened him before hadn't forgotten. And they were about to return, this time not just with words, but with consequences. And when that moment came, he would have to prove whether he had truly learned to stand or fall back into the same darkness that had almost destroyed him.